In this video, Senior Executive Directors Nina Anderson and Kelly Hinson are going to guide you through steps to a successful host coaching.
This is Nina Anderson, and I'm going to share with you host coaching is about creating a partnership with your host. Communication is key to the success of your wine tasting, and that starts with communicating with your hosts. Communicate with your hosts on what to expect and do it frequently. Use a duplicable system that makes it easy for you to repeat with each host what you have. This will create a relationship with your host. You will both be on the same page, and your host will be more likely to help you achieve the outcome you are seeking at your tastings. Your communication should be geared around what works for each of your hosts. Some will prefer talking on the phone, some love texting, Facebook messaging, or email. You can use one or more of these methods too, but most importantly, ask your host how they like to be communicated with and use that method. They will respond to you more when you use their favorite communication format.
Hi, this is Kelly Hinson from Iowa. Host coaching starts at the tasting and during your opening. Your opening is an opportunity for you to plant seeds of what will take place at the tasting. This also helps the guests at the tasting to get an idea of what to expect at their tasting. So look at your opening as a mini host coaching session. Here's an example of what you can say. Okay, so what we're going to do tonight is a 1-ounce sample of each of these wines. We're going to have so much fun. We're going to do some basic wine training along the way, and at the end of the tasting, you can purchase any wines that you like in any quantity. You will purchase the wines directly from our home winery, Wine Shop at Home, and the wine will ship from our winery directly to you. Typically, guests purchase 3 to 6 bottles, and my real wine lovers often buy half or full cases. I usually find a home for at least 2 to 3 cases of wine at each tasting I do. A couple of you are already thinking about wine-loving people that you know, and you might end up booking your own tasting by the time we're done tonight.
Book your new host at the end of the tasting. At the end of your tasting, when you are receiving interest forms and getting some bookings, take a few minutes with your new host to share. First, give them a host packet with some simple instructions on who and how many people to invite, how to set up the room, the foods to serve, and so forth. This is not meant to replace future communications with your host, but to give them a head start on how to plan. Next, ask how they prefer for you to communicate with them again. Text, email, phone, or Facebook message. And let them know that you'll follow up within 24 to 48 hours to gather a few more details, how the invitations will be sent, the time for their tasting, and to answer any questions that they may have.
Host coaching continues over the next 2 days. You want to connect with your host within 2 days of booking with you to keep them excited and engaged. You can even use a checklist to keep yourself on track so you don't forget to share all the pertinent details with your host. This checklist should include the following items. Confirm the date and time of the tasting, who to invite and how many guests are recommended. We recommend up to 12 guests. This makes for comfortable seating and plenty of wine for everyone. And this gives you crowd control by keeping the size of the tasting more manageable. What does your host need to provide? Let your host know you'll send them some information that will also include a short shopping list of what to get for the pairings. How the invites will be sent. Let your host know that you, the wine consultant, will create the invitation for their tasting. This will allow you to stay in control and make sure the invitation is created. By creating the invitation for your host, you will also have control of the wording that will be used. We like to call this intentional language, and it will provide clear information to all guests of what they can expect at a tasting, an opportunity to purchase wine, book their own tasting, or even become a wine consultant. Next, ask your host which type of invitation they would prefer that you create, an Evite or a Facebook event. Once you've created the invitation, let your host know it's ready for them to start inputting their friends and send it out. How much time should your host plan for the tasting? Let your host know that you will arrive about 20 minutes prior to the tasting. The wine tasting should take no more than 1 hour from the first pour to the last, and you'll need about 15 minutes afterwards to collect interest forms, bookings, and so on. When will your host be invoiced for their sampler? approximately 15 days prior to their tasting date.
Next, let's talk about sharing the host perks with your new host. Make sure your new host knows they will receive some great host perks, and we love to reward our host. It all starts with our exclusive host thank you bottle they will receive at the beginning of their tasting. You also want to let your host know that they can receive credits towards wine, accessories, stemware, and gift sets. And additionally, they can also earn up to 50% off items. Be sure to share with your host that the guests that do book with you will also receive $10 off on their order at the tasting. By sharing this information, you are planting a seed with your host up front about what benefits they will receive, and this also helps them to make sure they have guests on their list that like to entertain.
Host coaching tips leading up to your tasting. We've all heard the phrase, the fortune is in the follow-up. Staying in touch and continuing to communicate with your host leading up to their tasting will elicit great results at the tasting. Always assume the tasting is happening. If you bring up the option to cancel or reschedule, sometimes they could take you up on it even though they weren't even thinking that. People do what you expect. Focus on looking forward to the tasting.
Next, 10 to 12 days prior to the tasting date. Ideally, right after the wine tasting sampler ships out, let your host know when to expect their sampler and include the tracking information for them. This can be done via email, text, or Facebook message. Here's an example of what you can communicate with your host. Hi, Jennifer. I hope you're looking forward to your wine tasting on March 1st. Below is the tracking information for your wine tasting sampler. It looks like it's set to arrive this Friday, so be on the lookout for FedEx. Remember, someone over the age of 21 has to sign for it. There's nothing for you to do with the box for now, other than store it in a cool, dry place and make sure you don't drink it. When the tasting gets closer, I'll have you chill the whites and the sparkling. Let me know if you have any questions at this point. Otherwise, I'll be in touch a few days prior to your tasting to check in about your guest count. Have a great week. Do a quick check-in on the number of guests your host is expecting. If someone can't make it to the tasting, they can still place an order or they can still book their own tasting.
Next, 2 days prior to the tasting date, check in with your host for a few final details. How many guests are you expecting so far? If the number is low, help your host with a few suggestions on how to get the guest count up. Make sure your host is reaching out to their friends to make sure they saw the invites. Evite, for example, can end up in spam mail, or someone may have intended to RSVP but forgot. Do you have any questions about the food pairings or the setup? Remind your host when you'll be arriving, and ask your host to put the sparkling and the white wines in the fridge.
Next, host coaching continues when you arrive at the tasting and when you're doing your setup. When you arrive at your host's home, ask the following questions. Who's coming tonight? Friends, family, neighbors? Next, ask, is anyone interested in a booking? Wine Shop at Home offers some great perks if you book a wine tasting. Tell them which wines are really popular right now. A tasting guest purchased a case of the Le Mer de Vey last week, and then almost every other guest put on their orders too. Do you have outside orders? Remember, even people who can't attend can still order their favorite wines.
This wine tasting host planner comes in your business kit and is a resource for you to use with your host. Please note the wine tasting sampler is purchased by the host of the wine tasting. The independent wine consultant acts as the marketing agent of the Wine Shop at Home wines, providing educational information during the tasting. All sales transactions occur between the host and the home winery. Wine can only be purchased by the persons who are 21 years and older. Further questions about host coaching, please connect with your upline leader or your sponsor.